There's, again, this beautiful passage, right? In Zephaniah, the king of Israel. So there's the king, right? There's our theme. The kingdom is coming. The Lord is in your midst. You shall never again fear evil. On that day it will be said to Jerusalem, do not fear Zion. Do not let your hands grow weak. The Lord your God is among you, a warrior who saves. He will rejoice over you with gladness. He will be quiet in his love. He will delight in you with singing. Again, what a beautiful text, and what a wonderful truth that the Lord delights in his people. And some people, well, probably we've all struggled with this at times, but some people really struggle with the idea that God's always angry with them, even as believers. But that's not true, is it? And we see a text like this, that God delights in his people. God delights in you. As I was preaching, I'd say to our congregation rather regularly, of course, some people in the congregation are sinning, probably dramatically, and you don't know it. Got to be aware of that. But I would just say rather regularly to them, if you're following the Lord and you're confessing your sins, God's happy with you, right? You're pleasing him. And I would say that's probably true of most of you in here. God is pleased with how you're living because you're following him, you're trusting him, you're obeying him. When you're sinning, you're confessing your sins. Because some people have this impression, right, that every day God's just mad at them. Not if you're his child. Not if you belong to him. Haggai, very short book, right? At the end of the canon, the Lord will shake the heavens and the earth, the sea and the land. He's going to bring down the kingdoms. There it is again, the kingdom's going to be fulfilled, right? The Lord's kingdom will be established through Zerubbabel, who's in David's line, the promise to David of a king. The kingdom's going to come through a king, isn't it? The later glory of the temple will be greater than the former. Now, here our eschatology shows up. I understand this to be fulfilled in the new creation. Some people, maybe some of you, think it's fulfilled in the millennium, in a literal temple. Of course, you could argue, even if you're premillennialists who think the temple is coming, you could argue this in the millennium and the new creation. You could see it in both places. Zechariah, once again, all kinds of things in Zechariah. Jerusalem will be chosen, so forth and so on. All kinds of passages about future fulfillment. In Zechariah, we have a king coming. Maybe I'll just read Barry Webb here. Barry Webb says, the arrival of the Messiah will be the time for false shepherds to be judged, for the dispersed flock to be regathered, and for the new Israel to be created. So the Lord will save his people. They will repent and they'll turn to the Lord. Those who don't turn to the Lord will be judged. And then we see Malachi. Yahweh's name will be great among the nations. A messenger will come to the temple to purify his people, and the Lord will fulfill his covenant promises finally. So that's basically the book of the 12. Right? Judgment, salvation. Day of the Lord is judgment and salvation. The kingdom's coming. When the kingdom comes in its fullness, the wicked will be judged, the righteous will be vindicated, and God will fulfill his covenant promises. Right? To say the kingdom's coming, another way to say that is a new David's coming. So looking at the prophets as a whole, I like to put it this way. It's just easy to remember. A new David's coming, a new covenant's coming, a new Exodus is coming, and a new creation is coming. Those are 4 different ways of talking about the coming of the kingdom. There's a new covenant, a new arrangement with his people where God will fulfill his promise. There's a new David, a Messiah coming. There's a new Exodus. God's going to deliver his people. There's a new creation. The world's going to be transformed. So, anything you want to say about the book of the 12? Yeah.
Any last words how you would preach to the minor prophets?
I think what I'd do is I would just, because they're kind of, most of them are shorter, not all of them, but I'd intersperse them between doing other things in little bits. So I think they're nice, do a little series on Zephaniah or Jonah, but not too long, right? But most of them are short enough that you could do 4 sermons on Malachi, 4 on Jonah, and move through them rather quickly. But they're nice if you're doing a longer series to have them interspersed in between. And that's what the pastor at our church now, I mean, I did that when I preached. Maybe I just preached Jonah. Did I preach another one? I can't remember now. But he's done that with a couple. He did Micah, and then he just did Zephaniah. Just short little series after he did a longer series. And it seemed helpful to me. Anything else? Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on the application of the Christian life being the difference between the New Covenant and the Old Covenant when you're going through the 12? For example, all the issues of covenantal cursings, how does that apply to the Christian's life when we are under a different covenant?
Yeah, that's a very good point. We're not under that covenant. Those covenant cursings don't apply to us directly. Our land, right? Our land's not going to be cursed if we sin. Our land may be cursed, but there's not that direct link, is there? So how do we apply those covenant cursings? I think the way the New Testament picks it up is the covenant curse is hell. It's the final judgment. The covenant blessing is what? Finally, eternal life. So it still relates to us today. Finally, those who reject the Lord, they're going to be cursed. And what is that curse? It's the final judgment. Now, of course, there are passages where you could say there's consequences for sin. But I think when the prophets are thinking of covenant cursings, I think the most natural canonical link is final judgment. And covenant blessing, the most natural canonical link is heaven itself, the new creation. So why is that helpful? Because we want to constantly remind people in our preaching anyway that their eternal destiny is at stake. We don't want to just preach to the unbelievers there, but even believers need to be reminded regularly of the gospel. So, yeah, great question. Anything else you want to say? Okay. So we come to the end of the Old Testament. Let's think of where we are in the story, right? God's given these promises. Covenant creation, they sin. And covenant with Abraham, land, offspring, blessing. That covenant with Israel, covenant cursings have basically taken place because of their sin. So by the way, just to be careful, right? The covenant cursings in the Old Testament aren't hell, are they? They're physical punishments. Now, they may be going to hell too, but the focus in the Old Covenant is physical judgments, isn't it? So, by the way, can I just connect this to this answer since we're thinking about this, right? Hebrews does the very thing I said. Those warning passages in Hebrews, it says, look, Israel suffered in an earthly way. Now you're being warned from heaven. So he takes that language and says, there's a greater judgment than earthly punishment. It's eternal. So we can, in all the warning passages, Hebrews picks up on that. You have a greater judgment. So it takes those covenant cursings and it applies them to eternal realities. So anyway, back to the story. So that promise to Abraham is going to be fulfilled through a king, right? A Davidic king. We see in the story, with David, Solomon, then everything starts going south. Then they go into exile. They're out of the land. They return to the land. We see, words from Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. But say 400 BC, where are we in the story? Well, they're in the land, right? They're in the land, but they're very weak. They're definitely not exerting any worldwide influence, and they're kind of at the mercy of other nations. So 1,600 years have gone by, 2000 BC, right? 1,600 years. Imagine 1,600 years ago from today, right? 500 AD. Well, 400. Wow, that was a long time ago, right? I don't know my relatives that far back. So God has given these amazing promises, and yet it seems as if it's hardly gone anywhere, right? If you think of the whole story, So what are we reminded of again? God isn't in a hurry. Sometimes some seminary students, they come in. I was in a hurry as a seminary student, but they're really in a hurry to finish. I understand finances, family. It's not wrong to finish as soon as you can. But I always say to them, remember, God's not in a hurry to accomplish his plan. And furthermore, he doesn't really need you. He can use you, but he doesn't need you. The kingdom will be just fine without you. So, don't be in too much of a hurry to finish, because learn while you're here to prepare you for a lifelong ministry, to really know the scriptures well in our complex world. And we read in the story, wow, God's working slowly. 400 BC, then just fast forward 400 years. What happened in those 400 years? Not much, right? 400 more years to the time of Jesus, right? Basically, Israel is mainly under the thumb of the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. I don't know if you know that history, but they're under the thumb of other powers. So 400 more years go by to the time of Jesus, and you could be pardoned for thinking that this is never going to happen, right? This is never going to be fulfilled. And yet, when we come to the New Testament, there's still a remnant out there waiting for the promises to be fulfilled. So, when we come to the New Testament, I just like to think of it like this. We have these different groups. I may not spell these right. I'm a terrible speller on some of these things. But the Sadducees, who are the Sadducees? They're kind of the secular power group. I guess they think God will still fulfill his promises, but we help out a lot. We do what we can to get ahead. I mean, the Pharisees are a lay movement. So you volunteer to be a Pharisee. You're not, the Sadducees were the elite aristocracy. They were the moneyed class. But the Pharisees were lay people, and the Pharisees really wanted the kingdom to come, and the kingdom will come through our obedience to Torah. That's what they were expecting. If we can just keep the Torah, there was a saying, if we could just keep the Torah, if everybody could keep the Torah for one day, then the kingdom would come. And the Pharisees, especially the work of Jacob Neusner, if you know Jacob Neusner's work, quite astonishing. The Pharisees wanted the purity of the temple to reach the entire land. If we can only be pure, if we can only do what God says. And then the Pharisees, however, got involved. I mean, it's complex, but in some respects they had common cause with the Hasmoneans. Right? And the Maccabees, some people call them, right? Although they didn't always. I mean, Alexander Jannaeus, do you know that name? Alexander Jannaeus was one of the Hasmoneans. I think he ruled from 103 to 176 BC. And the Pharisees didn't like him. And they had a parade through the streets, and they took citron fruits and threw them at Alexander. You don't do that to a king. He crucified 800 of them. You don't do that. He's like, he would not tolerate that. So, but essentially they compromised. So another group that arose were the Essenes. At least of course this is disputed at Qumran. And basically, the Essenes said, look, basically we're so secular, we need to, the people running the temple are so secular, we can't have anything to do with what's going on here. We're going to start our own movement. We're going to go out to Damascus. There's going to be a new covenant. There's going to be a kingdom. If you've read the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's going to be a war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, and the kingdom's going to come in. But we're going to, with our radical obedience to the Torah, bring in the kingdom. And they were strict. I mean, if you've read some of these documents, if one of their meetings you laughed, You're out. Don't laugh during the meeting. Don't spit, and many other rules as well. So you have these various groups, and at least in the wings there's a lot of disputes whether this is an official party yet. Some people, but you have a zealot type movement arising, and we see this with a person named Judas at the time when Jesus was born, where they would not participate in the census. They wouldn't participate in the census because you're acknowledging another Lord, right? So that tax question was big for Jesus, right? You're saying there's another king. That's idolatry. God's our king. We don't pay taxes to anybody else. So you could, sort of like American freedom fighters, of the Revolution. We do not listen to anyone else, and so there were all kinds. If you've read Josephus, there were all kinds of movements going on, where people were saying they're going to bring in the kingdom. So we're still talking about the kingdom, right? There, people rising and saying, "Look, we're going to go down to Jerusalem, and the walls are going to fall down, and we're going to take over. It's going to be like Jericho again, right? God's going to lead us to a great victory." There are all kinds of movements like these, all kinds of people rising up and basically claiming, we're the Messiah. We're going to bring in the kingdom. And of course, they all failed, didn't they? Gamaliel brings up Theudas, right, in Acts chapter 5, as one of the people who said this sort of thing. And he brings up Judas as well, Judas of the census. He brings him up in Acts 5. So when we come to the New Testament times, there's, not surprisingly, different views out there, different interpretations of what's going on, but people are waiting for the kingdom. Incidentally, we don't have time to read it here, but you could read the Psalms of Solomon, chapters 17 and 18, which is a pseudepigraphical book. It's definitely not written by Solomon. It's not in our Bible, but those chapters are very strongly written about 50 BC, probably by a Pharisaic movement, and they were clearly waiting for the Messiah to come. So I just say that to say, in some ways it's kind of remarkable. The years go by, they're still waiting for the kingdom to come. Most of them have not given up hope. So we come to the New Testament, and we come to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We look at the Gospels first. And what themes do we see relative to the kingdom? Well, not surprisingly, we see fulfillment, right? We see fulfillment and a king. The promises, what are the Gospels all saying? The Gospels are saying the promises are fulfilled. And of course, for Matthew, you all know this, right? It screams out in the first verse, he's the son of David, the son of Abraham. Well, anybody who knows the story knows, boom, boom, there it is. There's the promise. So, if someone told you to read the Bible for the first time and you're an unbeliever and you open it up and could this be more dull? But for a Jew, and Matthew, I think, was especially written for Jews, this is of great significance, isn't it? We notice the bookends in the book. He's Emmanuel, and I am with you always. He's not only the son of Abraham and the son of David, but he's also the son of God. And so, Biblos Geneseos recalls, right, the book of Genesis too, doesn't it? The book of the beginning. Here we see the book of the fulfillment. Matthew often redactionally, do you know what I mean by that? Matthew often editorially designates Jesus as the Christ in telling the story. That's Matthew's hand as he tells the story. You have a choice as an author. You could call him Jesus. You could call him Lord, and of course he does at times. But he also chooses just to identify Jesus, not part of the story itself, right? But he chooses to identify Jesus as the Christ. So we see his editorial hand. Matthew's not writing a neutral historical description. He's writing from a biased, inspired point of view, right? He's writing from a perspective, but it's God's perspective. People say, no one writes from a neutral perspective today. Postmodernists recognize that. We as Christians can say, of course, that's true. None of the gospel writers wrote from a neutral perspective, but nobody has a neutral perspective. But they did write from God's perspective. Their biased perspective is the right one. Of course, postmodernists don't believe that, but they're wrong. So we also see, though, if you read Matthew, you can separate out Matthew's editorial hand, designating Jesus as the Christ, and the confession of him as the Christ by others. And it's quite interesting, or the Son of David, because who's confessing him as the Christ in the book? The blind, right? A Canaanite woman says, "You're the Son of David." How surprising. The common people and children, but the religious leaders say no. Well, that's very striking in the story. They mock him for claiming to be the Christ, but who sees it? The little people see it. Just picking up on themes, right? There's going to be a new Exodus. What does Matthew tell us with the genealogy, splitting it into the 3 generations and having the exile play a major theme? The exile's over. The exile's over. The promises of the exile of a new Exodus have been fulfilled in Jesus. He's telling us that in the genealogy. The king has come. There have been many kings, but here is the king. All the promises are coming to pass. He will save his people from their sins. Matthew 1:21. He's Emmanuel in the fullest sense. So we already talked about that prophecy. I take the prophecy that the Messiah would come from Bethlehem as a direct prophecy. But some of the fulfillment passages in Matthew are very difficult, aren't they? So we'll talk about 2 of them. He'll be called the Nazarene. Whoa, what is he talking about? In the Old Testament, there's not just a really clear passage there, but perhaps he's talking about Jesus being a Nazarite. There's not a direct prediction there, right, that the Messiah would be a Nazarite. I mean, Jesus literally wasn't a Nazarite because he drank wine, right? But perhaps Matthew's saying Jesus is the fulfillment of all the Nazarites represented in that he was totally dedicated to God from birth to the end, to death. Maybe he's saying that, right? So we see, I want to interpret the Old Testament the way Matthew does. We see an inspired commentary. Or maybe it's both, but maybe he has in mind Isaiah 11:1. A shoot will grow from Jesse. And when we look at the Hebrew, it's Netzir, right? A branch from his roots. So but it's not like, oh, that's easy, right? Oh yeah, I saw that one. He picks something that's pretty obscure, doesn't he? Yet he sees the fulfillment. I take it, some scholars say, well, Matthew just got it all wrong. That's a weird rabbinic view. We can't hold that weird rabbinic view today. Some people say, like Longenecker, he was inspired, but it wasn't the best hermeneutic. It's a Jewish hermeneutic, but I don't go those directions. I want to say he's teaching us how to read the Old Testament. We follow his pattern. Now we want to be careful. We want to be careful about going too far in other passages. But I want to say, well, I'm just challenged by reading that passage, and I say, whoa, that's not so clear. But is it a mystery revealed? Mystery revealed, I think. Or Hosea 11:1, which he also says, out of Egypt, when Israel was a child, I loved them, and out of Egypt I called my son. Matthew says, now let's get out of the Hebrew here. Matthew says, as you all know, that's fulfilled when Jesus is taken to Egypt and brought up. There's a fulfillment of that prophecy. We might say, whoa, wow, wait a minute. Let's go back and read Hosea again. That's not a prophecy. That's not a prophecy. When Israel was a child, I loved them, and out of Egypt I called my son. That's a historical passage talking about the Exodus, and indeed it is. Of course it is. You always want to read the Old Testament in its historical context. He's talking about the Exodus from Egypt, obviously. Obviously. Who's God's son? It's Israel. And then let's read the rest of the chapter, though. Israel called the Egyptians. They kept sacrificing to the Baals. So I think what Hosea is saying there is, I called them, but Israel was a sinful people, verse 2. But I love them. I taught Ephraim to walk, right? What a beautiful image. You take your child by your hands and let him walk at the beginning. Now we're seeing that with our grandkids. They never knew I healed them. I led them with human cords, with ropes of love. To them I was like one who eases the yoke from their jaws. I bent down to give them food. I delivered them from Egypt. Verse 5, now the historical context of Hosea. Israel will not return to the land of Egypt, but Assyria will be his king because they refuse to repent. So this is written to the northern kingdom. He is prophesying here that the northern kingdom will be exiled to Assyria, right? They're not going back to Egypt. They're going back to Assyria. A sword will whirl through his cities. It will destroy and devour the bars of his gates because of their schemes. The Assyrians will come in and destroy them. My people are bent on turning from me. Though they call to him on high, he will not exalt them at all. Now listen to this. How can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I surrender you, Israel? How can I make you like Admah? How can I treat you like Zeboim? I have had a change of heart. My compassion is stirred. I will not vent the full fury of my anger. I will not turn back to destroy Ephraim. For I am God and not a man, the Holy One among you. I will not come in rage. Now, what do those verses mean? Is he saying, I'm not going to send you to Assyria? That's not what he's saying, because they did go to Assyria, right? What are these verses saying? He's saying those are two cities. Isn't that interesting? He doesn't pick Sodom and Gomorrah. He picks the two little cities that were destroyed, Admah and Zeboim. But they were destroyed along with Sodom and Gomorrah. So what are these verses saying? I'm going to send you to Assyria, and you're going to be judged, but I'm not going to totally wipe you out. That's what he's saying. I'm not totally wiping you out. I'm not revoking the promises. You're going to be judged. You're going to go to Assyria. But it's not over. So what will happen? You're coming back. Return from exile. They'll follow the Lord. He'll roar like a lion. When he roars, his children will come trembling from the west. They will be roused like birds from Egypt. They're not in Egypt. Why does he mention Egypt? New Exodus. It's not literal, right? And they're like doves from the land of Assyria. You're coming back. There's going to be a return from exile. Return from exile. So now why have I done all this? I forgot. No, I'm kidding. I know why I did it. Why did I do this? Why am I here? There's a reason. How did the chapter start? He starts the chapter by saying, I called you out of Egypt. He ends the chapter by saying, I'm going to rescue you from Assyria. What I did in the past, the old Exodus, anticipates a new Exodus. Why does Matthew relate this to Jesus? Because Jesus, I'd argue, is the true Israel. Finally, God fulfills this promise of a new Exodus in Jesus himself. He's the fulfillment of this promise God has made. He's the one. He's the true Israel. Israel is comprised with him. Isn't that what Paul says in Galatians 3:16? Who's the true seed of Abraham? Who's the only seed of Abraham? It's Jesus himself. The promises are fulfilled in him. So it isn't a prophecy. It's a fulfillment, mystery revealed. It's a fulfillment that trades on the whole biblical storyline we've looked at. That's what he's saying. So the Baptist, right? Isaiah 40, what's Isaiah 40 about? Return from exile. What does Jesus say? The preparer is the Baptist. Elijah is the Baptist. Now, we may have some differences of opinion on this. I'd love you if you disagree with me, and I hope you love me. So notice how I emphasize that more. But anyway, Jesus tells us who is Elijah? The Baptist. So I think it's very interesting that so many people emphasize another Elijah is coming. I don't think that's true, by the way, but some people do think it's true. But I think it's so fascinating that when Jesus says the Elijah is the Baptist, so many other people think it's someone else, the historical Elijah. But Jesus himself interprets the passage for us. Who is the Elijah who's coming? Because the disciples are like, well, this can't be happening because where's Elijah? And Jesus says, actually, rethink the way you understand the fulfillment of the Old Testament. John the Baptist is Elijah. That's what I'm telling you. That's how you ought to interpret it. The dove settling on Jesus at his baptism symbolizes what? The new creation. You have a dove. The Spirit is a dove, right? At the creation of the world, you have the dove coming out of the ark with Noah. So a new creation is coming. Jesus is God's beloved Son, right? At his baptism. You are my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. Who is God's Son? Israel is his son. Israel is my son, my firstborn. Who is God's son? David is his son. But who is God's son supremely? Who is God, the Son of God with the only Son of God with whom God is well pleased? Jesus. So I think it's hermeneutically legitimate to say Jesus is the true Israelite. He's the only true Israelite. That's why Paul says, right? The only way you can be children of Abraham, Galatians 3, Romans 4. The only way you can be children of Abraham is if you have the faith of Abraham. The only way you can be children of Abraham, sons of God, is if you belong to the Son, Jesus himself. This passage is so fascinating, isn't it? This is my beloved Son. You're the true Israel. You're the true king. You have a special relationship with God, with whom I am well pleased. And that passage, so much packed in there, right? Because this is my chosen one, I delight in him. I'm well pleased in him. There it is, right? I delight in him. I'm well pleased with him. Jesus, in this one little verse, he's the true Israel. He's the true king. He's the servant of the Lord. But we already saw what? The servant of the Lord is Israel. But there's a servant who's separate from Israel. We already saw that in Isaiah. And that's Jesus. Jesus is the servant. Jesus is the chosen one. Jesus is the one who has the Spirit. All these prophecies, not a surprise, right? But they're coming to be fulfilled in Jesus. He's the servant who gives his life as a ransom for many. So, I'm going to have to go faster with some of the other Gospels, but what I want to say here is that kingdom that's coming, all these promises are fulfilled through Jesus' death and resurrection. I'm going to say one more thing and then we'll take a break. And that is this. I'm really annoyed by this great emphasis that people have rightly had on the kingdom in the Gospels in the last 20 years. But I'm really annoyed with how many people who've emphasized the kingdom have diminished the cross. I don't know if you've followed that. But all the Gospels end with the cross and the resurrection. The three Gospels that really emphasize the kingdom, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all emphasize the cross. If you're reading the Gospels and you emphasize the kingdom and you don't emphasize the cross and the resurrection, you don't understand it, right? You don't understand the kingdom. So I want to recommend here a book that I think does this beautifully. If you're not familiar, Jeremy Treat, and I can't remember, I reviewed this book. You could even Google my review somewhere, but is it The Crucified King or something like that? I can't remember the name of it anymore. But it's a great book because I think he beautifully puts together the kingdom and the cross and the resurrection. And a lot of people aren't doing that. So I think Treat's book, in fact, I haven't been as annoyed in the last few years ever since Treat's book has come out, because not as many people are doing it because Treat did such a great job.